town of Millbrook had always prided itself on its quiet charm and neighborly harmony. Nestled between rolling hills and ancient oak groves, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where disputes were settled over coffee at Martha's Diner, and where the most controversial topic in recent memory had been whether to install new streetlights on Elm Avenue. That all changed on a humid September evening when Mayor Patricia Henley stood before a packed town hall, her hands trembling slightly as she held up the artist's proposal. "Citizens of Millbrook," she began, her voice carrying across the room where nearly 300 people had crammed into seats meant for 200. "As you know, we've received a generous donation from the estate of Harold Blackwood to commission a monument for the town square." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was expectant. Harold Blackwood had been Millbrook's wealthiest resident before his death 6 months prior, a reclusive industrialist who'd made his fortune in mining operations across the region. His unexpected bequest of $2 million for a town monument had been the talk of every dinner table for weeks. "The artist we've selected," Mayor Henley continued, "is Victor Sokolovsky, internationally renowned for his provocative works." She turned the easel to reveal the proposal, and the room erupted. The design showed a towering bronze figure nearly 20 feet tall, depicting a man in mining gear, standing triumphant atop a pile of what appeared to be human bones. His face was Harold Blackwood's, rendered with unsettling accuracy, but his expression held a cruel satisfaction that those who'd known the real Blackwood swore they'd never seen. The figure's mining tools were stained with what the artist had indicated would be dark red patina, and carved into the base were the words, "Progress demands sacrifice." "This is an abomination," shouted Dr. Emily Richardson, the town's historian, as she shot to her feet. Harold Blackwood's mining operations displaced entire communities, destroyed sacred Native American burial grounds. And his companies had more safety violations than any other operation in the state's history. From the other side of the room, Harold's nephew and current head of Blackwood Industries, Marcus Blackwood, stood with equal fervor. "My uncle was a visionary who brought prosperity to this region. This monument honors his legacy and the industrial heritage that built our community." The room fractured instantly. On one side sat the families whose ancestors had worked the mines, the current Blackwood Industries employees, and the business owners who'd profited from the company's operations. On the other side were the families who'd lost loved ones to mining accidents, the environmental activists, the descendants of displaced communities, and those who'd always viewed Harold Blackwood's wealth with suspicion. Mayor Henley banged her gavel repeatedly, but the shouting continued. Old friendships shattered in minutes as neighbors who'd shared holiday meals found themselves on opposite sides of an increasingly bitter divide. "The artist's vision is already complete," Marcus Blackwood announced over the din. "Construction begins next week." The will was very specific about the timeline. "We'll stop it through the courts," Dr. Richardson fired back. "This monument is a celebration of exploitation and death." As the meeting dissolved into chaos, no one noticed the temperature in the room had dropped nearly 10 degrees. No one saw the shadows in the corners seem to writhe and pulse with their own dark life. And no one heard the sound that wasn't quite a whisper, wasn't quite a laugh, that seemed to echo from the very walls themselves. Victor Sokolovsky arrived in Millbrook on a gray October morning, driving a black van filled with sketches, sculpting tools, and notebooks written in a language that looked like no earthly tongue. He was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely white hair and eyes the color of old pennies. When he smiled, which he did often, his teeth seemed too sharp and too many. He rented the old Hartwell mansion on the outskirts of town, a Victorian monstrosity that had stood empty for nearly a decade after its previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances. Within days, neighbors reported strange sounds emanating from the property at all hours, rhythmic hammering, machinery that ran continuously, and what sounded like chanting in an unknown language. Sarah Chen, a local reporter for the Millbrook Gazette, was among the first to interview Sokolowski. She found him in the mansion's converted studio, surrounded by clay models and bronze casting equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for the cramped space. He told her in his thick Eastern European accent, "is not meant to comfort. It is meant to reveal truth. And truth, Miss Chen, is rarely beautiful." The clay models scattered around the studio were disturbing in ways Sarah couldn't articulate. They depicted human figures in various states of agony and transformation, their faces contorted in expressions of terror or ecstasy. She couldn't tell which. The smell in the room was overpowering: sulfur, hot metal, and something organic that reminded her of a butcher shop. "The people of your town," Sokolowski continued, working a piece of clay with hands that moved too quickly to follow. "They think they know their history. But history is written by those who survive to tell it. My monument will tell the true story." "What true story is that?" Sarah asked, fighting the urge to leave. Sokolowski's smile widened. "The story of those who didn't survive to tell theirs." That night, Sarah couldn't shake the image of those clay figures. She found herself researching Harold Blackwood's business practices, diving deeper into records than anyone had bothered to look before. What she found chilled her to the bone. The mining accidents weren't accidents at all. They were systematic eliminations of workers who tried to organize or speak out about unsafe conditions. Entire families had disappeared after opposing Blackwood's expansion into indigenous burial grounds. Environmental protesters had vanished without trace. The official records had been sanitized, but coroner reports, missing person files, and testimonies buried in legal archives painted a picture of a man who'd built his empire on literal mountains of corpses. But even more disturbing were the references she found in Blackwood's personal papers, documents that had somehow found their way into public archives after his death. He wrote extensively about the old ways and blood contracts, and something he called the Eternal Compact. His journals were filled with diagrams that looked like occult symbols, and lists of names with dates beside them. Dates that corresponded to mysterious deaths and disappearances spanning back decades. Construction on the monument began despite a legal challenge that was mysteriously dismissed by a judge who'd previously been expected to side with the opposition. The work proceeded with unsettling speed, as if the bronze itself were eager to take shape. The town's division deepened with each passing day. Families stopped speaking to each other. Businesses refused to serve customers from the opposing side. The local police, led by Chief Tom Morrison, himself a son of a Blackwood mines supervisor, seemed to turn a blind eye to increasingly frequent acts of vandalism and harassment. Emily Richardson organized protest vigils around the construction site, but these were met with counter-protests from Blackwood supporters. The confrontations grew more heated each night, and by the third week of construction, the first blood was shed. It happened during what should have been a peaceful candlelight vigil. Dr. Sewer. Richardson and about 30 supporters had gathered around the half-completed monument when Marcus Blackwood arrived with twice as many of his own people. The confrontation started with shouting, escalated to shoving, and erupted into violence when someone threw a rock. In the melee that followed, old Mr. Peterson, a retired mine worker who'd lost 3 fingers to a cave-in 40 years earlier, struck Dr. Richardson with his walking cane. The crack of wood against bone echoed across the square, and Richardson crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from a gash in her forehead. But it was what happened next that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their short lives. As Richardson's blood hit the ground near the monument's base, the partially completed bronze figure seemed to respond. The metal gleamed more brightly. The bronze took on a reddish hue that hadn't been there moments before. And for just an instant, several witnesses would later swear, the statue's eyes moved. The crowd dispersed quickly, but the damage was done. The next morning, Richardson was found dead in her hospital bed. The official cause of death was listed as complications from her head injury. But the night nurse would later tell anyone who'd listen that she'd seen something impossible. Emily Richardson had opened her eyes moments before dying, and those eyes were solid black, like polished obsidian. Her final words, whispered in a voice that didn't sound human, were, "He's waking up." Sarah Chen's investigation into Harold Blackwood's past led her to Maria Santos, an elderly woman who lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. Maria's grandfather had been one of Blackwood's first victims, a mine supervisor who'd threatened to expose safety violations in 1943. He didn't just kill them, Maria told Sarah over coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He fed them to something that lived in the deep mines, in places where the earth itself was wrong. Maria showed Sarah a collection of newspaper clippings, police reports, and testimonies her family had collected over decades. The pattern was clear. Harold Blackwood hadn't just been a ruthless businessman. He'd been something far worse, a man who'd made pacts with entities that existed in the spaces between reality. My grandfather wrote letters before he died, Maria continued. He said Blackwood had found something in the deepest mine shaft, something that had been sleeping in the earth for thousands of years. He said Blackwood made a deal. Lives for prosperity, souls for success. Every person who died in those mines, every family that disappeared, they weren't just casualties. They were offerings. The revelation explained the journal entries Sarah had found, but it raised an even more terrifying question. If Harold Blackwood had been feeding some ancient entity for decades, what had happened to that entity when Blackwood died? "It's hungry," Maria whispered, her eyes reflecting a fear that seemed to have been passed down through generations. "It's been sleeping since Harold died, but that statue, that's not a monument. It's a summoning." That night, the temperature in Millbrook dropped 20 degrees below normal. Frost covered every surface despite the fact that it was still October. And in houses across the town, people reported the same nightmare. A figure made of bronze and shadow, walking through their homes, leaving bloody handprints on walls and windows, whispering in voices of the dead. The monument neared completion as October bled into November, and with each day, the town's madness deepened. The division that had started as a political disagreement had transformed into something primal and violent. Neighbors who'd lived peacefully side by side for decades now watched each other through curtained windows, hands never far from kitchen knives or hunting rifles. Victor Sokolowski worked tirelessly, often laboring through the night by the light of torches that burned with an unnatural blue flame. Those who dared venture near the construction site reported that he seemed to be having conversations with the partially completed statue, speaking in that unknown language, while the bronze figure appeared to listen. The first disappearance occurred on November 3rd. Janet Murphy, a schoolteacher who'd been vocal in her opposition to the monument, vanished from her locked house sometime during the night. The only evidence of her fate were the bloodstains that led from her bedroom to her front door, and the fact that the monument's bronze finish seemed somehow richer, more vibrant, when the sun rose the next morning. Over the following week, 3 more people vanished, 2 Blackwood supporters and 1 opponent. The police investigation was perfunctory at best, hampered by the fact that Chief Morrison himself had been seen talking to the statue late at night, nodding as if receiving instructions. Sarah Chen knew she was running out of time. Her investigation had revealed the full scope of Harold Blackwood's occult activities, but more importantly, she'd discovered what the monument was truly intended to accomplish. Hidden in Blackwood's estate papers was a ritual diagram and incantations that made the statue's purpose clear. It wasn't just a memorial to Blackwood. It was a vessel for his return. The bronze figure would serve as an anchor point for Blackwood's spirit. Powered by the ancient entity he'd served in life and fed by the lives and souls of Millbrook's residents. The town's division, the violence, the disappearances, it was all part of the ritual. Every drop of blood spilled in anger, every life lost to hatred, made the summoning stronger. But Sarah also found something else in the papers, a potential counter-ritual, written in Blackwood's hand, but clearly copied from some other source. It was titled The Binding of the Copper King and required specific actions to be taken during the moment of the statue's awakening. November 15th was set as the monument's official unveiling, despite the town's barely contained violence and the growing list of missing persons. Mayor Henley, now a hollow-eyed shell of her former self, had become obsessed with completing the ceremony, claiming that the town's troubles would end once the monument was properly dedicated. Sarah had tried to rally support for stopping the unveiling, but the few allies she could trust were either missing or too terrified to act. Dr. Richardson was dead. Maria Santos had disappeared 3 nights earlier, and most of the town's original opposition had either fled Millbrook entirely or vanished under mysterious circumstances. As the sun set on November 15th, nearly the entire remaining population of Millbrook gathered in the town square. The monument stood complete, draped in black cloth that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Viktor Sokolovsky stood beside his creation like a proud father, while Marcus Blackwood prepared to give the dedication speech. But Sarah noticed something the others missed. The bronze figure beneath the cloth was moving, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the slight shifts in the fabric's drape gave it away. Whatever was inside was breathing. The ceremony began at exactly midnight, under a sky so dark that no stars were visible. Mayor Henley's introduction was brief and mechanical, as if she were reciting words that had been programmed into her. Marcus Blackwood's speech was even stranger. He spoke about his uncle's vision and legacy, but his words seemed to be in two languages simultaneously, English phrases mixing with the same unknown tongue Sokolovsky used. He grasped the rope that would pull away the monument's covering. "Citizens of Millbrook," he declared, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own throat. "I present to you the eternal guardian of our prosperity." The cloth fell away, and hell came to Millbrook. But he was not the same man who had died 6 months earlier. This was something larger, more terrible, fed by decades of sacrifice and empowered by the ancient hunger that had slept beneath the earth. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some people screamed and ran, but they found their legs wouldn't carry them more than a few steps before invisible forces dragged them back. Others fell to their knees in worship, overwhelmed by the presence of something that their primitive hindbrain recognized as a predator beyond their comprehension. The bronze Blackwood turned his massive head to survey the gathered townsfolk, and when he smiled, his metal teeth gleamed like knives in the darkness. "My faithful servants," he spoke in a voice like grinding gears and distant thunder. "You have fed me well. Your hatred, your violence, your precious blood, all of it has nourished my return. But this is only the beginning." He gestured toward the crowd, and people began to scream as their bodies started to change. The Blackwood supporters found their skin taking on a metallic sheen, their eyes turning to bronze, their humanity draining away as they transformed into extensions of their master's will. The opponents discovered something worse. Their flesh began to rot and slough off, revealing the writhing darkness underneath, as they became sustenance for the entity that had slumbered in the deep places of the earth. Sarah Chen watched in horror as her neighbors became monsters or food, but she clutched the counter-ritual instructions she'd memorized and waited for her moment. According to Blackwood's notes, the binding could only be performed during the first few minutes of the awakening, when the connection between the bronze vessel and the spiritual entity was still forming. As the bronze Blackwood raised his arms to begin what appeared to be an expansion of the transformation ritual, Sarah stepped forward. "Harold Blackwood," she shouted, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "I name you as murderer, despoiler, and servant of the hungry dark. By the laws of earth and spirit, I challenge your claim to this place." The bronze figure turned toward her, and Sarah felt the full weight of its malevolent attention. "A challenger?" Blackwood's laughter was like breaking glass. "You know nothing of the powers I serve, little journalist. I have fed the deep hunger for 60 years. I have earned my place among the eternal. But you have not earned your claim to this town," Sarah replied, pulling out a handful of soil she'd collected from each of Blackwood's victims' graves. "By the blood you spilled unjustly, by the lives you took in darkness, by the compact you made with entities beyond human understanding, I bind you to face the judgment of those you wronged." She threw the grave soil at the base of the statue, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. The bronze began to crack, and from those cracks poured not molten metal, but something far more disturbing: the screaming voices of every person Harold Blackwood had ever killed. The soil from the graves created a circle of power around the monument, and within that circle, the spiritual realm bled through into the physical world. The air shimmered and warped, and suddenly the town square was filled with translucent figures, the ghosts of everyone who had died to feed Harold Blackwood's ambitions. They came in waves, the miners who'd been buried in accidental cave-ins, the families who'd disappeared after opposing his expansion, the environmental activists who'd vanished without trace, the workers who died from deliberate exposure to toxic materials. Hundreds of spirits, their eyes burning with righteous fury, their voices raised in unified accusation. The bronze Blackwoods staggered as the weight of their collective judgment pressed down upon him. "No," he roared, swinging his massive arms to dispel the ghosts, but his blows passed harmlessly through them. "I paid the price. I fed the hunger what it demanded. These deaths were necessary, and, quote, necessary for your greed," replied the spirit of Maria Santos's grandfather, stepping forward from the crowd of the dead. "Necessary for your power, but never necessary for any good purpose." The bronze figure began to crack more severely as more voices joined the accusation. But Sarah realized that the binding ritual wasn't complete. She needed something more to anchor the judgment permanently. End quote. The compact. She shouted to the spirits. "Show us the compact he made." The ghostly figures parted to reveal another presence, something vast and alien that had been hiding behind them. This was the entity from the deep places, the thing Harold Blackwood had served in life. But now, faced with the judgment of its victims, even this ancient hunger seemed diminished, somehow constrained by the weight of innocent blood. The entity spoke in a voice like shifting stone. The bargain was for his lifetime of service, in exchange for worldly power. His death broke the compact. His return was not agreed upon. Sarah felt a surge of hope. "Then you have no obligation to sustain him." "Correct, mortal. The bronze vessel was his own creation, fed by stolen lives and forbidden rituals. It exists outside our agreement. We do not protect what we did not create." The bronze Blackwood let out a howl of rage and betrayal as he realized the truth. His resurrection had been powered by the blood sacrifice of the town's division, but it wasn't supported by his original pact with the deep entities. He was alone, facing the judgment of his victims without the protection he'd enjoyed in life. The spirits of Harold Blackwood's victims began to circle the bronze statue, their ethereal forms leaving trails of silver light in the darkness. With each orbit, the cracks in the metal spread further, and a sound like a massive bell being struck underwater echoed across the town square. Sarah could see that the people who'd been transformed by Blackwood's initial spell were beginning to revert to human form as the source of their transformation weakened. But those who'd been consumed by the hunger weren't returning. They were truly gone, digested by forces beyond mortal comprehension. "NP, you cannot unmake what I have accomplished," the bronze Blackwood raged, his voice growing more distorted as his form continued to deteriorate. "The deaths I caused, the power I gained, the fear I created, these things are permanent. They have weight. They have meaning." The spirits surrounding him began to speak in unison, their voices blending into something that was part prayer, part condemnation, and part reclamation of their stolen lives. "We take back our fear. We take back our pain. We take back the power you stole from our deaths. Harold Blackwood, we deny you. We unmake your works. We reclaim what was ours." The bronze statue began to collapse inward, not melting, but rather being consumed by something invisible that left only empty space behind. The transformation was beautiful and terrible, like watching a star die in reverse, darkness rushing in to fill the space where malevolent light had been. But as the bronze figure crumbled, Sarah realized there was one final danger. The entity from the deep places was still present, still hungry, and without Harold Blackwood to constrain it, there was nothing to prevent it from claiming the entire town as compensation for its lost servant. The ancient thing began to rise from the cracks in the earth around the monument's base, its form a writhing mass of shadow and reaching tentacles that existed in too many dimensions for human eyes to properly process. The surviving townspeople screamed and fled, but Sarah knew that running would only delay the inevitable. "Wait," she called out to the spirits, who were beginning to fade as their primary target was destroyed. "The entity is still here. It's still hungry." Maria Santos's grandfather turned back to her, his ghostly form already translucent. "We can bind it, but only temporarily. The permanent solution requires a living sacrifice, someone willing to take Blackwood's place as its anchor point." Sarah felt the weight of understanding settle on her shoulders like a leaden cloak. Someone would have to volunteer to become the entity's servant, to take on Harold Blackwood's role as keeper of the deep hunger. It was the only way to prevent the creature from consuming the entire town in its rage at being denied its promised feast. The surviving townspeople huddled at the edges of the square as the entity from the deep places writhed upward from the earth, its alien geometry hurting to perceive directly. It was easily 50 feet across and growing larger, its form a constantly shifting mass of darkness, punctuated by what might have been eyes or mouths or organs for which humans had no names. Sarah looked around at the people she'd lived among her entire life, the neighbors who'd been transformed by hatred and fear, who'd allowed their community to tear itself apart over a monument that should never have been built. They were innocent in their ignorance, but their innocence hadn't protected them from being used as pawns in a game they couldn't understand. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Then louder, "I'll take his place." The ghostly figures turned toward her in surprise. "Child," said Maria Santos's grandfather, "you don't understand what you're offering. To serve as anchor for such an entity means eternal bondage. Your soul would be bound to feed it, to provide it with the sustenance it needs to remain dormant." Harold Blackwood managed it by sacrificing others, but that path led to this moment. The righteous path requires self-sacrifice. "I understand," Sarah replied, though her voice trembled. "But I also understand journalism. The truth needs to be preserved. Someone needs to remember what really happened here, to make sure it never happens again. If I become the anchor, I can ensure the entity remains dormant, while keeping the memory of tonight alive." The entity seemed to sense her offer and turned its attention toward her. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of mountains grinding together. "Acceptable. The compact Harold Blackwood broke can be reformed with willing participation. But know this, mortal. The hunger must be fed. If you cannot provide it with the sustenance it requires through willing sacrifice, it will take what it needs through other means." "What kind of sustenance?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Life force, spiritual energy, the essence that separates the living from the dead. Harold Blackwood fed it through murder and fear. You must find another way or become a murderer yourself." Sarah closed her eyes and thought quickly. There had to be another solution. Some way to provide the entity with what it needed without perpetuating the cycle of death. Then she remembered something from her research into Harold Blackwood's journals, references to voluntary tithe and willing offerings that suggested the entity could be sustained by smaller contributions from many people rather than the complete consumption of a few. What if the entire town contributed, she asked. Small amounts from everyone, willingly given rather than everything from unwilling victims? The entity's form rippled in what might have been consideration. Possible. But such an arrangement would require absolute honesty about the compact's nature. No secrets, no lies. Every participant must understand exactly what they are agreeing to. Sarah turned to face the surviving townspeople, about 60 souls who represented what remained of Millbrook's population. "You've seen what secrets and lies have cost us," she told them. "I'm offering to become the guardian that keeps this thing asleep, but only if you're all willing to help. It would mean a small portion of your life energy, voluntarily given once each month. You'd age slightly faster, but you'd live. And more importantly, you'd live with the truth." The silence stretched for long moments. Then Chief Morrison, who'd reverted to human form when the bronze statue was destroyed, stepped forward. "I saw what my blindness cost this town," he said. "If sharing the burden means no more secrets, no more people disappearing in the night, I'm willing." One by one, the other survivors agreed. They were tired of the fear, tired of the division, tired of pretending that their community's prosperity hadn't been built on blood. They wanted the truth, even if that truth came with a price. 6 months later, Millbrook bore little resemblance to the town it had been. The monument had been replaced by a simple memorial garden, where the names of Harold Blackwood's victims were carved into black granite stones, arranged in a spiral pattern. At the center stood a small fountain, where the bronze statue had once dominated the square. Sarah Chen had indeed become the anchor for the entity from the deep places, but her approach to the role was radically different from Harold Blackwood's. Instead of hiding the truth, she'd established the Millbrook Historical Society, dedicated to documenting not just their town's recent horrors, but similar events throughout history. She'd turned transparency into a weapon against the kind of willful ignorance that had allowed Blackwood to operate for so long. Every month, On the night of the new moon, the surviving residents would gather in the memorial garden for what they simply called the sharing. Each person would place their hand on the fountain and voluntarily give a small portion of their life energy to keep the deep hunger dormant. It was a solemn ceremony, but not a fearful one. They approached it as a community responsibility, like paying taxes or voting. The price was real, but manageable. People aged perhaps a year for every 10 they lived, and some found that their hair grayed prematurely, or that they tired more easily than they once had. But they also found something they'd never expected: genuine community. The shared burden and the absolute honesty it required had forged bonds stronger than any the old Millbrook had ever known. Sarah herself bore the heaviest cost. As the primary anchor, she aged more rapidly than the others and carried the constant awareness of the entity's presence in the deep places beneath the town. But she also carried something else: the gratitude of the dead and the knowledge that she'd found a way to break a cycle of violence that had persisted for generations. Viktor Sokolovsky had vanished the night the statue was destroyed, leaving behind only sketches and clay models that the townspeople had burned in a ceremonial bonfire. No one mourned his disappearance. The town's population never recovered to its previous levels. Too many had died or fled, and Millbrook's reputation as a place where impossible things happened kept most newcomers away. But those who remained built something new from the ashes of the old community, something based on truth rather than comfortable lies, on shared sacrifice rather than the exploitation of others. On quiet nights, Sarah would sometimes hear whispers from the deep places, reminders of the entity's eternal hunger and the fragility of their arrangement. But she also heard other voices, the spirits of Harold Blackwood's victims, who had found peace in knowing their deaths were finally acknowledged and their killers' works undone. The monument that had been meant to celebrate exploitation had instead become the catalyst for a community's rebirth through honesty and sacrifice. It wasn't the ending anyone had wanted, but it was an ending they could live with. And in the deep places beneath Millbrook, something ancient and hungry waited patiently, fed just enough to remain dormant, held in check by the willing sacrifice of those who had learned that some truths are too important to hide, no matter what the cost of facing them might be. The bronze monument was gone, but its lesson remained: that prosperity built on others' ends. Suffering is never truly secure, that secrets always surface eventually, and that sometimes the only way to defeat a monster is to become something better than it ever was. In the end, Millbrook survived not by avoiding the darkness in its history, but by choosing to carry that darkness together openly as a shared responsibility rather than a hidden shame. The monument to Harold Blackwood was gone, but the monument to what a community could become when it chose truth over comfort would endure far longer than any bronze statue ever could.